including those represented here, really, I think, do represent the top of the field here. No longer can we describe them as emerging architects. I think we can happily say that they have fully emerged. So it's your job now to evaluate the consequences of that emergence. So, and in a sense, that's really, that's really what brings us together here. An effort to, with Enrique, to try to stage a discussion, a debate, maybe even an argument in the spirit of the arguments series that the AAD program has been running, to tease out some of the undercurrents, if you'll pardon the usage, of not so much I mean, there will be, of course, a lot of discussion about the particulars of the projects, but the stakes of the work and particularly how it articulates itself in the broader field. So towards that end, before introducing our panelists, the setup will be this. I will introduce everybody right now, so we can, and we have 3 of the 5 teams represented here. We've limited this to current Columbia faculty, partly also, I should say, as a way to look in the mirror a little bit and have some sense and maybe introduce you to some of the work and discussions that you're likely to encounter here at Columbia. So I will introduce our speakers, and who each will present about 10 minutes. Basically, they'll present their projects to you, and after which Enrique and I will pose to each of us. We will pose questions that we've actually discussed a little bit in advance. So we've prepared this in order to try to steer the discussion in a specific direction. We'll see if it complies. And so I'll give just also to our colleagues a little bit of a advanced hint as the kinds of questions that we had in mind. For my part, I was interested in, given the nature of this project, this is the hypothetical project. Maybe I should give a little bit of background so that way these guys don't have to give you every detail. But that is very unusual for MoMA. I mean, I must say, although it is very much in a tradition, an older tradition of workshop-type exhibitions that MoMA has hosted. There were a number of such exhibitions in the 60s and early 70s. And so the idea was, and I'll speak on behalf of my colleague Barry Bergdahl, who was the curator of the exhibition, that there was an issue, the issue of the rise of the water level in New York Harbor. There was a site, the harbor itself, and there were a series of architects who, through a fairly elaborate process, were invited to address that issue on that site, or really on 5 different sites around the harbor. What's interesting to me about that setup, and what I had would like to ask in more detail later, is that the nature of that narrative presupposes something like a long-term future. It's almost a kind of science fiction exercise, and that was certainly the first impression I had when entering the exhibition. That basically you're entering a science fiction show, but it's the science part and the fiction part are in a sort of complicated and maybe interesting dialogue. Science fiction in the sense that it extrapolates out of present conditions a future, a long-term future. We're talking about these projects are basically 50, 80 years, addressing conditions that are expected 50 or 80 years down the road, and the scientists can't exactly tell you what really to expect. And obviously this reflects conditions in the present, the state of the environment. So not to say long-term historical trends. So my question essentially has to do with relationships between past, present, and future, and what it means to think and operate in that sort of those temporalities, and just to try to translate a little bit and summarize what I think Enrique is going going to ask about will have to do with, in effect, each project's argument, the claims that it makes as an architectural and urbanistic proposition, and specifically regarding the city. In a sense, the kind of city that it imagines, the sort of propositions vis-a-vis the city. And I think maybe we could understand this a little bit in relationship to the I think really fantastic strategy of inducing arguments out of people that Enrique has become very adept at, and I know that you've been doing all summer. So I think you can expect some prodding from Enrique on that note, and probably some others as well. So I think that's probably enough to introduce the format and the frame. And so I will just now, three in a row, introduce our speakers, each of whom will then present their work, and then we'll pick up the discussion. Be prepared, though, yourselves with questions as you look and listen, because that's really the spirit of this. The idea really is to try to based on the work, to have a hopefully lively and high stakes discussion about its claims and its possibilities. So to begin with, we will have Eric Mungi, who in partnership with Mimi Huang, are the principals of the firm N Architects. N Architects was founded here in New York City in 1999. The variety in their body of work demonstrates the firm's interest in in variability itself, aiming. So you can hear some of. I'm just reading our sort of the bios that we've culled from the internet, so you can try to anticipate a little bit. Variability itself, aiming for maximum effect within an economy of conceptual material means and a positive impact on the environment. The firm's award-winning projects include the bamboo canopy from MoMA PS1 of 2004, the ephemeral pavilion Wind Shape in Lacoste, France in 2006, and the 7-story Switch building in Manhattan in 2004 to 2007. And in fact, N Architects this is maybe a related phenomenon. It's quite interesting about architectural culture here in New York. N Architects is one of 24 firms retained by New York City's DDC for the Design Excellence Program, and one of 8 pre-qualified architecture firms by the New York City Parks Department. In addition to working with these city agencies, they're currently working with the City of Paris on a digital hall for a public square in Porte de Montreuil in Paris. Following Eric will be Mark Zermacki, all of whom, I should say again, teach in different dimensions of our studio and other curricula here, so you're likely to encounter these figures elsewhere too. But Mark is going to represent his firm, the partnership of Lewis Zermacki Lewis, with his partners David Lewis and Paul Lewis, or LTL Architects, which is a design-intensive architecture firm founded in 1997 by these three figures. LTL engages a diverse range of works from large-scale academic and cultural buildings to interiors and speculative research projects. They realize inventive solutions that turn the very constraints of each project into the design trajectory, exploring opportunistic overlaps between space, program, form, budget, and materials. LTL Architects is the recipient of the 2007 National Design Award for Interior Design from the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum, and was selected as one of 6 American architectural firms featured in the U.S. Pavilion at the 2004 Venice Biennale. Their work is in the permanent collection of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the Heinz Architectural Center at the Carnegie Museum of Art. In 2009, indeed, again, LTL Architects were selected by New York City Department of Design and Construction, that's DDC, to participate in the Design and Construction Excellence Program. They are currently completing work on Art House at the Jones Center in Austin, Texas, and the Administrative Center for the Claremont University Consortium in California. And finally, Kate Orff will represent her firm Scape. Scape is a design-driven landscape architecture and urban design studio. It shares a commitment to innovative design and construction of the urban landscape. Its goal is to create an organized dialogue about the built environment, to refine the definition of the public sector to include natural processes and wildlife habitat, and to cultivate an ethos of civic participation. Scape is currently working on the remediation of a 200-acre brownfield site in Greenville, South Carolina, the first in a series of nature center projects. The studio currently has 5 projects on the board with, again, the New York City Department of Design and Construction. That maybe this is a subtext of the DDC. And large projects underway in both Battery Park City and along the East River. So again, you can look forward to much more in this city and elsewhere from these firms. And we're here today to discuss their proposals for this city. So with that, I'll invite Eric to take over, and we'll welcome all of our participants. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have the first slide, please? Do I need to do that, Reinhold? Or? Yeah, there it is. Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Thank you, Reinhold. Thank you, Columbia. Just with this, right? Yeah. In the spirit of disclosing arguments, I thought I'd start with a few images of our proposal that we submitted back in October for consideration to participate in this, which also allows me to introduce the team: my partner Mimi Huang, myself Eric Bunge, and our 4 team members: Sangtek Lee, Sanjukta Sen, Noah Levy, Maria Lobaton. Julia Chapman joined us as well, and 2 important collaborators, Arab New York and Matur Dakuna. The second page the third page of our submission was a kind of spoof of a meeting agenda that we might have were we to be selected. And from this, I want to disclose a few of the arguments or issues that we thought would be important and that stayed with us. 5, in fact. The first one was, in fact, the issue of vision and future itself. And we included a quote from Louis Kahn, and I quote, "I was asked by General Electric Company to help them design a spacecraft. One person put an illustration on the table and said, 'Mr. Kahn, we want to show you what a spacecraft will look like 50 years from now.' I said immediately, 'It will not look like that.' And they moved closer to the table and they said, 'How do you know?' I said, 'It was simple. If you know what a thing will look like 50 years from now, you can do it now. But you don't know because the way a thing will be 50 years from now is what it will be.' But the issue in bringing this up is to look at the problematic relationship between prescribing for the future in relationship to the issue of agency in a large project like urban design. So we thought the interesting issues would be problem definition, relationship to the existing city, and issues of representation of future conditions. The second issue is an issue of site, which is problematic in itself in a large project, but problematic especially in an aqueous terrain where fluid boundaries, no longer subject to planimetric or instrumental mappings of a ground, make it very difficult to determine what a site is, but also the whole issue of site in larger context of the future and our interventions as architects. The third is the issue of density. If we extrapolate projections for population growth, for every inch of rising sea level, which is not as slow as maybe Reinhold mentioned well, you never know, but it could be a 3/8 of an inch every year, we could have 200,000 new immigrants to the city. And so, we think that environmental issues should not be disassociated from social issues, real issues. Fourth, soft infrastructure, one of the premises posited by Guy Norton's team for the show, and its relationship to hard infrastructure and whether there could be a gradient between those that allows it better integrate with the city. And finally, issues of representation, which we'll get back to at the end. So starting with an image, this is the New York Harbor, Manhattan at the very top, Sandy Bay. Shown here is what engineers would recommend, one of 3 sites for a storm surge barrier at Sandy Hook. The point of the slide is not only to show that hard infrastructural conditions or solutions are, as we know now from Katrina and others, situations problematic in that they can fail and they're not resilient and multi-layered, but also the notion of site is that, as we know from the Gulf, that an action in one place really affects other areas. So for us, the first decision we made was that we don't think of it as a site at all, rather as a window onto a possible future. And this is our site of focus, Sunset Park in Bay Ridge in Brooklyn, Verrazano Narrows in Staten Island. So inherently a very varied set of conditions, both physical and social. And here you see the 20-foot inundation line of a Category 3 storm. So bottom right, Bay Ridge is pretty steep. It's not going to be affected by that much. Sunset Park quite significantly, and then on the left, Staten Island. The social conditions are also interesting. The residential communities there, there's pressure for them to grow as well as jobs to be maintained. So our strategies are threefold, basically, and you can enumerate them and see if we succeeded. But one is to bring the water into the land, make the city essentially more resilient to water, but also to embrace opportunities of living out on the water, not shying away from it. And we think that any sort of buffer of park or anything else is almost the same as a hard infrastructural condition in that it separates the city from the water. The second is a kind of acupunctural urbanism idea, to borrow from Jaime Lerner, an idea of dispersing infrastructure so that it will instigate habitat and sponsor communities and create a resilient city. And the third has to do with the problems I raised in the beginning, that rather than seeing this as a design problem, which for such a large project with many actors, with top-down thinking, bottom-up thinking, municipal and other city agency and state initiatives, as well as private initiatives, it's impossible to think of it as design. So we conceived of the whole project as a fictional zoning resolution, and chose a sort of title that is a spoof of 60s visionary projects, New AQUEOUS City. Hardly new because we're dispersing a lot of infrastructure. So I'm going to show a short video in a second that gets into detail about 3 very washed out slides. AQUEOUS neighborhoods, public piers, and barriers and islands. Should I enlarge this further? That is full screen, okay. The public waterfronts. We're extending the city to the water and bringing the water to the city with floating boardwalks and pier parks that capture sediment and provide habitat for wildlife. On the downcurrent side, wave-deflecting piers will serve as docks for a new tram and biogas-powered ferry. Sorry, that's the upcurrent side. On the downcurrent side, piers will capture sediment and sponsor habitat. Our objective ultimately is to create new dynamically changing public spaces that include mobile floating amenities on mobile barges and connections between land and water transport. Intertwined within this public waterfront and below the 20-foot inundation line, we imagine new neighborhoods resilient to sea level rise. Normally, we build from a shared street up. Our new AQUEOUS building typology inverts that by building down from a shared roof structure. The more risk you're willing to take, the closer to the water you hang your house. Instead of an active skyline, these neighborhoods would therefore be characterized by an active waterline. The resilience of these neighborhoods would also require a different approach to infrastructure. These buildings would be off the sewage grid. Treatment wetlands would process liquid waste. In addition to vertical circulation, the bridge supports would contain anaerobic digesters that would process solid waste. Biogas produced by each block could be used for cooking. We envisaged that the treatment wetlands and access boardwalks would float, adapting to tidal change and sea level rise. Comprised of modular concrete elements, these dynamic landscapes of public spaces would also serve as breakwaters, attenuating wave energy. In the event of a storm surge, the roofs would function as a safe evacuation zone. New AQUEOUS City addresses this paradox that as sea levels rise, the population of New York is projected to increase. But running for the hills is a luxury that we can't afford to take, and also an opportunity we can't afford to miss. Therefore, we felt strongly that about proposing a way to live with our future AQUEOUS condition. Any intervention in the harbor should be systemic and work at both environmental and social levels. But these systems may never need to be deployed. Further out in the harbor, we propose a system of islands built with modular elements submerged at a maximum depth of 40 feet. These islands would support a network of inflatable storm surge barriers that would fill with water and air only in the event of a storm surge. More than 2,000 of these dams have been successfully deployed throughout the world, but we propose to use them as a network between islands rather than as a single line of defense. For 99% of the time, however, they would simply look like this, like islands in which sediment trapped from the Hudson during low tide would over time instigate new habitats and uses, a kind of infrastructure in disguise. We imagine an archipelago, therefore, out in the New York harbor rather than a dam. So, as a zoning ordinance for this fictional city, we presented 9 points that have guided us, moving from the city out to the water. 1, subway. Start the new AQUEOUS city from the city's existing infrastructure. 2, corridors. Incentivize development corridors from land to water. Selectively maintain and reuse sites within a multi-use waterfront. 3, piers. extend municipal piers that serve as wave deflectors, ferry stops, and parks out onto the water. 4, ferries. Implement an active ferry service powered by biogas generated from sewage. The Owl's Head treatment plant generates enough sewage to power one ferry 25,000 miles every day. 5, tram. Place the harbor at the center of a new regional metropolis by connecting the 5 boroughs to New Jersey with a tram harbor loop. 6, islands. Build a network of wave-deflecting islands that allow sediment to collect and natural habitat to grow. 7, barriers. Link these islands with dynamic inflatable barriers to create a defensive line in the event of a storm surge. 8, pervious networks. Utilize vacant lots to create a pervious infiltration network with swales as well that will absorb stormwater and direct it back to the harbor. And finally, 9, aqueous housing. Zone new residential neighborhoods that are resilient to sea level rise. I just have one thing to show before we move to the next one, which is just a very quick overview of the exhibition itself. I thought this slide would be useful to show all 3 projects, in fact. Ours on the left, on the right, 4 wall panels, and you can see scapes in the distance, and to the left, LTLs. There's a large model by ARO on the left of the slide as well. And just briefly, we had, decided to make 4 pieces, each one of which tested representational techniques from this zoning and flow map that shows in orange the kind of infrastructural, acupunctural interventions to an AXO model that tries to look closely at one of the aqueous neighborhoods. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And next is Mark Sermaki.
Hi. As Reinhold mentioned, I'm Mark Sermaki. I'm one of the partners of LTL Architects who were the team leaders for Site 2, as so designated, rather Site 1, I've lost track, as so designated by the kind of curator of the exhibition. Our team, which I should mention because as you may know, all of these projects were generated in a kind of team context in a workshop format at PS1. Included Aaron Forrest, Megan Griscombe, Perlindis Christensdottir, and Yasmin Vobis. The site that we were given, which really became the sort of starting point, the kind of genesis of the project for us, was in a certain way unique among the various sites in being, unlike the portion of the harbor that Eric has just discussed, relatively underutilized and underpopulated. With the majority of the site, which is located in the sort of northwest corner of New York Harbor, comprising what is currently designated as Liberty State Park. The best known aspects of the site, of course, and the ones which are probably iconically familiar to everyone, are the historic islands of Liberty and Ellis Islands. However, the site is also characterized by a series of smaller installations, an extant and historically significant railroad terminal at the north end of the site, the CR and J terminal, as well as by the infrastructural monument of the New Jersey Turnpike, which really sort of defines the western edge of the site and divides it from the adjacent urban neighborhood of Bergen Lafayette. To the north of the site, you have the kind of recent development of Exchange Place, Wall Street West, if you will, which currently includes the tallest building in New Jersey, the Goldman Sachs Tower. What you have, however, in the center of the site, really the kind of vast portion of the site, is a broad, undeveloped territory. So if this is the familiar image that we all know of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, these historic sites, the area that really in the end interested us is what you see in the kind of back of the slide, which is an incredibly flat and generally vacant tract of land that comprises about 1,200 acres. The site itself is almost as large, about 3/4 the scale of Central Park, and is positioned actually in greater proximity to Lower Manhattan than Central Park itself. So one of the issues that raised for us was the capacity of this site to act as an incredible resource, as a kind of public or urban amenity, not only for New Jersey, but also for Lower Manhattan. The edge of the site, portions of the edge of the site have been developed starting around 1976 as Liberty State Park. This is the kind of current existing promenade along the water, featuring a kind of a battered sort of riprap seawall edge. However, the interior of the site essentially looks like this. It's a kind of emergent wilderness, if you will, which has some extremely unique biological characteristics. And really is the residue of a kind of industrial past. So this is the site sort of just after the turn of the century. And one of the initial exercises that we did was to conduct a historical research of the site, beginning to kind of look at its production, really. And what we discovered was really that the site is really an entirely artificial construct in its current status as land. And beginning about 150 years ago, in the kind of colonial era, the site essentially didn't exist. It was an estuarial flat that was used by the kind of local Hackensack Indians as a kind of oyster harvesting area. It was extremely sort of shallow, low-lying terrain, but essentially submerged under the surface of the harbor. Beginning then about 70 years ago, the site was infilled in a series of operations, primarily as a center for transshipment operations, basically rail-to-ship transfer. And you can see here the kind of successive building up of the site from about 1860 to about 1928, then its kind of current outline as it exists today. At the kind of sort of apex of the activity on the site in the early 20th century, it housed over 100 linear miles of rail yards, of railroad track, and also the largest train shed in the world. The terminal at the north end of the site, where the 2010 arrow is pointing, was actually the point of access for about 2/3 of the 12 million immigrants who emigrated to this country, came through Ellis Island, and functioned as really the means of entry for them into the interior of the United States. So the irony of this is that if the site didn't exist 70 years ago, if we look at the next 70 to 80 years as projected by the Latrobe study that really acts as the kind of foundation for the Rising Currents project, the site will once again be essentially entirely inundated. The site will disappear if nothing is done. So if we look at even conservative water level rise estimates, the kind of 2-foot water level rise estimate, about 70% of the site will be underwater, with the increasingly likely rapid ice melt scenario of about a 4-foot level rise, which is actually what we ended up utilizing as the parameter for our project. About 80% of the site is underwater, and in any of the more radical storm surge events, for instance, the 100-year flood, which will be occurring something more like every 15 years with global climate change, about fully 95% of the site is submerged. So what you have paradoxically is a site which didn't exist, which was essentially produced as a result of industrialization, which is now the kind of cause of its own demise, if you will. So what our project attempts to do is in essence preserve this land for public use. And one of the dilemmas that we faced on the site was that this is an area which I think even according to the study, which kind of prefigured the Rising Currents exhibition, this site was essentially allowed to simply disappear. And in a way, this would not represent the kind of economic or a sort of urban catastrophe that, say, the erosion of Lower Manhattan would. But we really were interested in seeing how we could, in a way, take advantage opportunistically of this seemingly kind of catastrophic situation to generate something kind of positive as a kind of design proposal. So what we did, in essence, was to rather than reinforce or kind of fortify the existing singular edge of the site, this kind of crescent-shaped western edge, we selectively allow for the infiltration of water into the site, pulling, in essence, the shoreline back into the interior and producing a series of 4 finger-shaped landscape piers, which are then further crenellated along their edges to produce a kind of sawtoothed interlocking between land and water. What this does effectively is to multiply the length of the coastline by as much as 10 times its existing length. So from an existing coastline of about 4.5 miles, we produce a new coastline, a kind of new boundary or kind of threshold line between water and land of approximately 45 miles at low tide. This does 2 really critical things for us. One is that it allows us, the site, to operate as a more resilient and porous buffer for storm surge events and for sea level rise in general. But it also maximizes the intertidal zone as a kind of a testing ground for new uses and inhabitations based on the dynamic interchange or exchange between land and water. The operation, importantly, is not about, say, importing or exporting material to the site, and it's really about a kind of conservation of matter, if you will, operating through a kind of cut and fill logic. So if this is the existing section of the site, as I said, extraordinarily flat, and easily inundated with relatively kind of modest increases in sea level. What we're proposing is a sectional resculpting of this historic fill, the kind of topography of the site, through a series of subtle shifts which would allow for areas to remain protected with the 4-level sea level rise, and a series of new kind of channelizations which would allow for water to infiltrate this site in a more controlled fashion. The other aspect of this is to really produce, through these kinds of sloping surfaces, a more dynamic interchange between the surface of the land and the surface of the harbor, essentially resulting in a kind of experimental terrain, which would be in a kind of constant state of fluctuation and change relative to both the sort of diurnal shifts of the tide of the harbor, which changes as much as 4 to 5 feet in this area, as well as the longer range projected change over the course of the next 70 years. The site is further activated then through a series of what we call programmatic anchors, which occupy the terminus of each of these landscape fingers, and which augment the kind of touristic functions of Ellis and Liberty Islands, essentially acting as attractors for activity and public inhabitation into the site. They also function to connect or to link the site itself into both the adjacent territory and the kind of larger context of the region and the harbor through an enhanced network of aquatic and terrestrial transportation. Secondarily, a series of loose programmatic territories then kind of cross-weave, kind of counter-grain to the kind of primary directionality of the piers, essentially resulting in a kind of diverse mix of uses, a kind of combination of productive landscape and public park, research and recreation. The zones are, starting from the top, a kind of agricultural zone for experimental agrarian installations, a recreational zone which would continue the public and kind of current aspect of the site as a form of public landscape or park, a remediation zone which would allow for the containment and treatment of the more sort of toxic soils on the site. The site is in many ways a brownfield due to its history of industrial use. A preserve which would begin to, which would allow for the kind of survival or the kind of continuation of some of the unique sort of species combinations and kind of biological conditions of the site, as well as a series of constructed wetlands. A research zone which would, again, contain these sort of experimental programs, and then an agricultural zone which would look at the idea of the harbor as a new sort of productive space. So the resulting plan, which you see here, is really a sort of new form of amphibious landscape, which would sort of combine in a very sort of frank way the kind of natural and the infrastructural. So we were interested in the idea that this site is neither a wholly artificial site nor a wholly organic one, and that the kind of resulting condition of the design really seeks to merge these properties and to kind of take advantage of them both. The other is that it's organized according to a series of modules which we called petri dishes, which in essence are a series of wedge-shaped inclined planes, which produce a kind of organizational module for the various landscapes and programs that inhabit the site. These are each structured essentially as a kind of a sloping territory with diverse degrees of engagement between the water and the land. So essentially you have hard edge separations and remediation zones where we need the kind of containment of soils, for instance, to kind of more gradual kind of sloping fields of estuarial exchange for aqua parks, aquaculture, and agricultural aspects of the site. They also kind of link into a new network of circulation, which is both vehicular but also pedestrian, engaging bicycles and watercraft on the site as well. We are interested in also developing relationships of kind of flow and kind of performative interdependencies within each of these territories. They're all then sort of developed relative to very different engagements with the water. So all of these begin to perform very differently in terms of how they kind of relate the kind of space of the harbor and the space of the park, and are terraced and kind of sculpted in kind of modified form, and then mapped against the possibilities and the proclivities of the different programmatic ideas that we wanted to sort of see emerge on the site. So the kind of net effect of this is to produce a landscape sort of shown here in this sequence of slides, which is not conceived as a static scenographic park according to the kind of 18th century model, but rather as a kind of active and continually transforming landscape, which would be sort of engaged in and really sort of made dynamic in perpetuity by this kinds of transformational relationships of the tide. And that would occur not only through the kind of twice daily shift within tidal cycles, but also over longer periods of time relative to processes of deposition and erosion, which we would sort of see actively kind of engaging within the context of the project. Speaking a little bit to the representation of the project within the context of the exhibition, we're also faced with a really interesting dilemma, which is that the site is really thought about primarily in sections, right? Really through a series of sectional operations, but those operations are really primarily visible through their effects and plan. Like a beach, for instance, a very subtle shift of a few feet begins to enact a radical transformation in the kind of planimetric dimension. So what we did was to construct a kind of topographic model which would act as a kind of projection surface for an animation similar to the kind of slide sequence that I just showed, and which would allow the public to sort of engage and understand the way this was not a kind of a single proposition, a singular landscape, but really a kind of constantly shifting and evolving design. We also devised a series of aerial panoramic views which would seek to kind of show the site from the water side, starting from the southern portion of the site, working to the north, the landscape pier that terminates in an aquaculture research and development center. Further inland are a series of marine hatcheries and hydrological testing facilities that correspond to the research program of the site. The structure itself is a kind of pier-like construction which hovers over the water and suspends a series of floating walkways that define research beds for the testing of various species within the context of New York Harbor. Further to the north, an amphitheater which would continue the function of the site as it currently exists as a venue for large-scale outdoor performances. They hold already kind of large-scale concerts here. However, in our variation on this, these performances would be visible not only from the land side, but also from the water via a series of camping barges and a nearby marina. So for us, it was incredibly important that not only the land, but also the surface of the water itself would be understood really as a public space that could be activated programmatically. Further inland on this finger are a series of tidal parks comprising beaches, pools, and islands which would appear and disappear with the fluctuations of the tide. The next finger, a water launch, which would allow for longer-term inhabitation of the site, which merges with the adjacent terrain at one end in a series of pools and terraces and rises out of the water on the other to shelter a marina for kayaks and other human-powered vehicles that would allow for the exploration of the various landscapes on the interior of the site via a series of water trails and elevated pedestrian boardwalks. And then finally, at the northernmost pier of the site, we're proposing repurposing the existing Central Railroad of New Jersey terminal, the historic terminal, into a regional market, which would distribute both produce from local farms in the surrounding territory, but also crops grown on the site, which we envision actually functioning as a kind of agricultural testing zone for saline and flood-resistant crops. Actually, one of the kind of critical issues with sea level rise globally is that many of the territories near the water in these coastal regions are not only inhabited, but many are very productive agrarian zones. So the decimation of large areas of farmland would be another result of this. And we envisioned the kind of existing terminal sheds extending from their kind of current limit and as a series of research buildings and public markets, and interweaving with a series of new testing fields which would allow for the development of species that would be more resistant to inundation in the kind of advent of these events. So in conclusion, the site, the project is intentionally ambitious and dependent upon the kind of productive and optimistic role of design, and intended to function not only as a demonstration of possibilities within New York Harbor as a new form of public landscape, but also as a prototype for conditions soon to be faced globally by many similar coastal areas. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And Kate Orff.
Okay, don't leave. I'll take the first slide. Oh, got it. Okay, hi. Oh, it's showing on my screen, so I don't know what's going on. Oh, okay. Okay, so I'm Kate, and I teach here, and I'm very excited to present this project in the Columbia context with this terrific audience. The title of our project is called Oystertecture, and it was interesting that Eric showed the sort of brief, that we all went to these interviews at the museum, and during my interview, I basically, for better, for worse, laid out a kind of a critique of the Guy Nordensson report that was kind of serving as the brief for the project. So luckily, that went well. It could have gone badly, but what I come to this project with is an interest that the sort of typical architectural motifs and strategies may not necessarily apply to something like rising tides or rising currents, as it's called. So, with the sense that, humans have kind of participated in this sort of aggregate way to generate excess carbon in the atmosphere through multiple millions of small actions, and now there's not really necessarily a big infrastructural fix or a sort of an architectural fix that can help get us out of it. So my concept was really to frame the entire project through the frame of living beings, animals, and people, and to try to sort of organize those behaviors in a different way to engage the issues. So we had this terrific team of here, Ben, Alice, Stephen, Angela, Stephen, who I hope you've worked with here, Angela and Gina, 3 Columbia, 2 Harvard, and we also partnered with the New York Harbor School, the Gaia Institute, some professors at Columbia, and a graphic design firm. We were given this site, Red Hook and the Gowanus Canal in Governor's Island, and if you'll notice, let's see, there's not a pointer, right? Here in the middle is this kind of large blue landform that immediately caught my eye. It's called the Bay Ridge Flats. And so one of the first things we did actually was to take a boat ride with our partners. This is Pete Malinowski, an oyster farmer and teacher at the Harbor School, out to the Bay Ridge Flats and sort of check out the water. Another thing we did was really to sort of look back at the history of this site, because for me, coming out of a background of liberal arts, philosophy, and history, I really feel like history is a tool. It's as powerful as any tool, because it sort of puts this entire project within a trajectory of landform and behavior and our interaction with the harbor. So we did sort of a history of our site. And you can see that, it was really a kind of Governor's Island, which is now part of Manhattan, was really part of this just arcing ring of islands that served as a kind of a natural breakwater for upland Brooklyn that was settled at the time. And the lowlands remained incredibly productive. Salt marshes, the Gowanus actually had, oysters the size of dinner plates. And, it was a very different kind of topographical signature. So we learned a lot from just this topographical signature and how the lowlands were incredibly productive. Settlement occurs on the upland, and that this creates a sort of a very positive dynamic between settlement and water. So the situation of the Gowanus now is quite different, of course, in the sort of industrial boom of New York. Most of these marshy areas were dredged and canalized to uniform width, and were, in the case of the Gowanus, dotted with manufactured gas plants, oil refineries, a whole range of different toxins. So for us, sea level rise, and this is our 2080 line here, is incredibly important from a public health standpoint, because you have these active communities which would be essentially affected by the further dispersal of these contaminants. And just after we completed the project, the Gowanus was listed as an EPA Superfund site. So I really felt like not just, the key here isn't just to address rising currents, but really to start to address three things. First is water quality, because if you know Vietnam, right, there's the way that the sort of landscape works, the inundation of the rice fields, the houses built to a certain level, it's a relatively good water quality. So it's not catastrophic if the floods occur. It's actually quite a positive thing. So water quality is sort of a key piece that's missing here. Secondly, storm surge, and thirdly, sea level rise became our kind of program. So again, with this notion of looking at the frame of living beings, we thought to address water quality with this sort of a biotic component with oysters, eelgrass, and mussels. Oysters specifically and mussels have incredible filtration capacity to address storm surge through this new landform mimicking the sort of historic landform out in the bay at the Bay Ridge Flats, and we called this our Palisades Bay Reef State Park, and addressing sea level rise with a sort of a new Gowanus fabric. So I was kind of calling our project Back to the Future, and here are those three elements in a sort of an overall view. So first of all, this notion of water quality. New York used to be a slow harbor with clean water, and it was a very active harbor. So what happened? I mean, oysters used to actually cover about 25%, oysters used to cover, at least 25% of the entire bay, and are now 1% of their former levels. But this oyster is an amazing animal because it's, through its kind of marvel of this beautiful digestive tract, it can accept algae, detritus, and pollutants, and outside the other end comes cleaner water. You can literally dip a tray of oysters in an algae-filled tank, and half an hour later remove that and the tank is clear. So all these oysters were actually capable of filtering the water in the harbor in a matter of days. We were also interested in the sort of culture of oysters because for me, I was particularly focused on the format of the MoMA being something that has a public component to it. It's not a project that I'm showing you, architecture students, although I'm doing that now, but it was very exciting to me to kind of start to try to use history to reach a broader audience and get some sort of, get my hands in, get really people to sort of focus on the situation now and what it is that they can do. So oyster carts were actually once as popular as the hot dog carts are today. And the second thing that oysters do is they can agglomerate and to form barriers and natural sea barriers. And reefs are the #1 kind of barrier that creates the most effective wave attenuation because it starts deep in the water column and it reaches up. And so that velocity, which starts deep in the water column, is then attenuated. And finally, with sea level rise, we were interested in this notion of kind of creating new habitats, not only for animals, but for people. And I don't know if, I'm sure many of you know this from your own research, but New York is, and Jamaica Bay and the New York Harbor is a sort of crucial stopover for migratory birds. This bird, unfortunately, is the American oystercatcher and is almost, is in steep decline. So we were inspired by this oyster, right, because of its qualities, its scalar properties, the agglomeration. And we're also inspired by actually the life cycle of the oyster, because what we learned was that on only a very short amount of time, and there's this, you don't eat oysters in the summer, there are all these kind of or months with R, there are all these kind of rules that we know when not to eat oysters, and that's because they're in this sort of reproductive phase, but it's sort of a constant reproductive phase. And they move from a sort of a fertilized egg to a free-swimming larvae to a spat, which is the moment in the oyster's life cycle when it kind of is swimming around and looking for something to attach to an adult male and female in a very short amount of time. So we looked at this life cycle as being kind of an inspiration at this larger site scale. And we thought about our whole site as being this cycle of regeneration based on this life cycle that could continue to build and grow this kind of new community-based sort of involvement, and also a renewed sort of ecosystem here. So we have sort of our shell recycling. The flushing tunnel becomes the beginning of our Fluxy process, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Flushing cleaner water through the Gowanus Canal, where we have our kind of nursery, and then those oyster spat are then paraded down the Gowanus Canal in these low bottom boats, and then seeded out in the reef. So you have kind of a cycle of regenerating life, and you also have the opposite happening, which is that the reef then in turn protects the inland Gowanus community. So that's the results, really. So we started to develop this reef structure because the harbor, as you also know, has been dredged and canalized within an inch of its sort of life. And one of the things we did was work with Paul Mankiewicz to try to visualize what the structure could be. And so one day he came into my studio and dropped a ton of this fuzzy rope on my floor, and we realized that this rope could actually be woven together and make kind of a soft infrastructure that would help spur the development of this reef. And so we began to think about knitting this fabric within a sea of piles that could be able to create this kind of sort of semi-soft hard infrastructure. So, and just as an aside, we all learned how to actually knit because we knitted our model. So this is how the wave attenuation barrier works with a sort of a grid of marine piles and bringing this sort of woven fabric from low in the water column up to the surface and basically working with piles of rocks and shoals to fully dissipate the wave energy before it hits Gowanus. And that's what it looks like. And a key part of this is because the harbor has been so decimated by dredging that oysters, when they do actually find something to attach to, they become sedimented out and covered with silt. So that's a key physical aspect of what our fabric does, is it holds the oysters above the sediment zone. And our idea too was that this oyster texture would then grow and evolve alongside the threat of climate change. So here's a kind of diagram of this agglomeration of the reef and the sort of development of new public space. Because of course, on the other hand, what I'm really most interested in is this notion of this kind of new watery public space that's created, this sort of blue network of sort of this is my sort of back to the future moment of how we used to sort of interact with the harbor. And so you basically creating this sort of water/land zone of boats, people, animals. This is a view of our model and one of the sort of research and dive stations there. So the main thing that this does also is create a new kind of central blue landscape, which is really, the kind of contemporary version, or the sort of Braveheart Waterworld version of park space for the next century. So as you saw, our exhibit was really, we basically just said, we're just going to do a section. So because this section, as you heard me explain, is really part of the key idea that this interactivity between upland and inland, in water and upland. So here's a section showing this wave action being dissipated, this sort of public space that results, the calmer water in the Red Hook Canal, and then finally to the Gowanus So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Gowanus Canal now. This is what it looks like today with these semi-viable industries that don't use the water on its edges, with sewage dumping regularly into the canal at CSO events. And so we're really just re-sculpting that land. And key here is adding this kind of flupsy path. The other trick with the Gowanus is that you cannot access it, right? There's no right-of-way along the edge. So we're creating kind of a right-of-way within the water, a productive right-of-way within the water zone. And key to this entire system, and I never know where to put this slide because you need it first and you need it last, is this flupsy system, which is called a floating upwelling system. It's really a sort of a nursery, oyster nursery, where little baby oysters are contained in these chambers. Water is pumped through, so it's like force feeding the oysters. And thousands and thousands and thousands of baby oysters are produced and then are protected from predators. So that's our thought was that basically we re-envisioned this entire Gowanus as a flupsy with this sort of turbine moving this water through that exists now, water through, and that we would basically take advantage of that existing technology. So this is our flupsification diagram, flupsification in public space, one of the many new words that we had to invent. And we really felt like post-Superfund that this project would really be able to be effective in terms of providing a kind of a restoration plan for this zone. So here's one of those CSO gardens, the oyster the oyster nursery. And then finally, this notion of, anticipating, because the first thing that anyone asks me, regardless, is when can I eat the oysters? And the answer is not yet. We did some calculations. We think it's like 2030, 2050. But basically, that this sort of oyster is don't eat the oyster, he's working. And finally, this notion of celebrating, which is really what we were trying to work with, and actually how there's a million, I'm sure my fellow participants can attest to the mountains of work left on the table, but we also devised this sort of system of participation within the reef. But one of the key things is also this notion of like parading down the oyster spat down to the down to the reef, and the way that really kind of works with the Gowanus community. And finally, celebrating and eating. This is our dystopian Brave New World view of the Gowanus in 2050, when you can actually enjoy a tasty Gowanus oyster. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to turn on the lights and ask everybody to come up. There's work to do. This is the real work, in a sense. I'm just kidding. But no, just to thank, first of all, our I have to say that these guys have been doing so much work after the exhibition. I've never seen an exhibition. They're doing a boat tour tonight. There's been a whole series of events and discussions. And so we do have to make this stimulating for our guests. I did want to thank Anna Kenoff for helping to put all of this together. You'll get to know Anna as the program coordinator of the Buell Center as we continue with activities through the rest of the year. But for now, maybe I'll just ask Enrique to elaborate on his question first, and then see where it goes, and then I'll try to develop my concerns.
I have one brief question, and I have many versions in case the question doesn't go through. But as Reinhold basically mentioned, the main issue is basically to try and see the argument that you're raising through the work you've produced through the projects. So the question is basically like beyond the specificity of the site and the operations and tactics that you propose for the site and for the problem of the rising currents. To what extent would you say you've also exploited the projects for the production of a number of arguments for the field? In other words, for envisaging other forms of architecture and other forms of urbanism. In other words, yes, as an incubator for new architecture and new ideas about the city.
You have to ask one of us.
Yeah. Okay, I'll start. No, I think it's a really great question in the sense that I think raises one of the dilemmas of the exhibition from the outset, which is on the one hand we were given this very particular charge to address rising water levels in a series of specific sites around New York Harbor. On the other hand, the context was MoMA, right, which comes with certain demands and expectations in terms of what you're presenting, and as Kay was just discussing, also the kind of question of audience, of who you're addressing and how you're addressing them. And so the condition was such that from our standpoint, talking a little bit about our project in particular, we felt that in essence the question of rising currents could be in a way completely obviated on our site. In other words, the site could disappear. No one would kind of cry over it as long as the historic monuments were preserved. And so for us it really became a kind of impetus or a kind of catalyst for beginning to think about a new way of thinking about a large-scale public landscape that addressed a sort of more active, dynamic, and performative component relative to, let's say, similar large-scale urban proposals that have occurred over the course of the last 20, 25 years. And you know, many of these conditions then became seen through the lens of the operation of the kind of engagement of the water, really, as a kind of sort of major element. On the one hand, that was a kind of tactical condition that was relative to the project, but for us it also became a more general way to rethink the way that we could understand the relationship between cities, landscapes, and the kind of, quote-unquote, natural condition of the harbor, right? And also to look at maybe the imbrication of natural and artificial systems through the kind of device of the exhibition, as well as the content of our particular site, which, as we were sort of talking a bit about, is already a kind of complex imbrication of those systems. So it's a site that now is perceivable as a natural kind of condition, but in fact was generated through a series of industrial and artificial processes over time. Right?
I guess in my case, I had also come to the project having just written like a really long essay about Jamaica Bay, which maybe some of you know here in the New York Harbor, but it's this big estuary down by JFK Airport, and it's this really kind of a watershed question. So it sounds, but taking lessons that I was learning from Jamaica Bay, and this notion is, for me, translated into the oyster texture project, and what I really kind of took out of it was this idea of scale as a strategy. And I don't know, because I feel like we all struggled with this notion of being given a site, right? So your site is inherently sort of demonstrative of something, but at the same time, in my office, we have big sites and small sites, but there's still you're always struggling with your boundaries in a sense, and actually being able to affect change. So for me, I really came out of oyster texture, rising currents, with this notion of scale and being able to kind of understand and articulate architectural strategies that are scalar and can be scaled up.
I think the question is very difficult because it puts us in a position potentially of trying to evaluate the resonance of our projects beyond the specific constraints or issues that we were trying to address.
Right.
But it also can be seen as a set of intentions. I mean, I think all three projects we've seen are attempting, through the specific understanding of the site, to solve or address issues that are global, or at least have larger scale ramifications, or they could be systemic. And so therefore, maybe the project is either capital P or small p in your question, the larger project of architecture.
Capital A, indeed.
Yeah, but I mean, it's, you can't get to a systemic or general idea without looking at something very closely specifically, but in architects, our approach was from the beginning just not really, and I think I should say that each of our sites certainly influenced the trajectory of each of our projects. I mean, if LTL had our site, would they have, looked at a sectional variation, it's not necessarily, and similarly with Kate's. But our site was very large, the largest one. We had a large variety of conditions, and clearly we were inclined to look at it as a sort of urban systemic set of conditions. We might have been inclined to think of a zoning resolution, but I think the scale of it definitely influenced, that. So.
I can go to the second. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, the second question has to do basically. It's basically The second question has to do basically with the question of the edge, and I basically, as far as I understand, the problem was posed in such a way that you had to rethink the edge, but basically looking outwards. It's basically the edge, the relation of the city, the edge of the city with the water, and potentially the idea of envisaging a new form of public space by embracing the water. Like there was a kind of open reference to Venice at some point, I remember from the previous presentation. So the question I have basically is, since you kind of all work with edges which are kind of diluted, where basically that welcome the water in all three projects, what is the relationship you establish between the edge and the inside? In other words, the way in which the edge defines not only its relation to the water, but its relation to the city. And in so doing, what kind of urbanism do you propose?
It's a crucial question, if I could take it first. Our collaborators, Matur de Cunha, have spent a lot of time looking at the kind of extensive gradient of what we now call the edge, that really there isn't a single edge, it's dynamic, it's shifting, and it's something in our thinking that's been produced by the evolution of planning, of the plan and the map, right? But in fact, if we think of it as a continuous estuarial condition, it's constantly changing, there is no single edge. But ultimately, we try to address this issue through a dynamic condition and a multiple condition. In other words, there are many edges. There's a pervious network that extends all the way into the city. So by trying to bring the city to the water and the water into the city, we try to confound that very, very issue. But the edge also, I think, is a disciplinary edge that is brought up here. And what are the tools and histories and so on that we need to corral to address this issue? And clearly, each project has exposed some thinking that transcends or transgresses, I think, that kind of edge too.
I would say that maybe the edge is problematic as a starting point because of the edge is the battleground to some degree, but it assumes some sort of adaptive that we're already in kind of, that architecture can really just adapt. And I don't know, because I feel like the issues with sea level rise are generated from surface for the most part, and the effects are felt inland and are most visibly demonstrated on the edge. So although, so I would say this notion of just architects, making soft edges is something that I think landscape architects, and we've been doing for many years, but it doesn't really address the core issues, even though it addresses some issues in that people interacting with the water, I think, is the first sense that things might change or that things could change. Because, certainly the edges of Manhattan and Brooklyn and many parts of New Jersey have been bulkheaded. And so that's contributed to a sort of ricochet effect of faster water, dirtier water, and so on. So clearly the edge has a role to play, but it's not, it sort of predefines the role of architects in this sort of adaptive design role.
Yeah, I think the dilemma of the edge, as being sort of laid out by my colleagues, was in a way precisely what we began to sort of end up focusing on, but not really, in a way, through its kind of misrecognition within the project. In other words, that the notion of edge, which even the term, as I think Kate's alluding to, presupposes the notion of a definitive limit at some point between urbanity and the kind of natural system, or between kind of disciplinary operations, et cetera. In our case, it became really interesting to start looking at kind of specifics of edge, and I think there's a broad way in which the rising currents projects are often kind of categorized as a kind of softening of the kind of hard infrastructural edge of the harbor, which I think is generally speaking true about all of the work that we did. However, I think there is this, if you begin to look at the kind of tectonics of the edge, the way it's kind of developed over time, and the kind of multiplicity of ways in which land and water can kind of engage, we became much more interested in say, deploying varying techniques through the kind of project that could begin to allow for different interrelationships between the kind of land and the harbor to exist. and in ways that would address varying conditions with the site, but also generate different human and programmatic interactions between the kind of public aspect of the park itself and the kind of the harbor as another kind of public space. And for us, there was this kind of really interesting change, which is that the edge is usually understood in plan. It's understood as a kind of plan figure. But if you look at it in section, it becomes a much more sort of complicated operation. And the other thing that I think everyone's addressing is that the temporal condition here, and we were talking about scale a moment ago, but I think scale applies here to kind of a time scale as well as a physical scale. That for us, it was a really great opportunity to begin to think about the kind of fluctuation of edge, not in a kind of singular way, but in a way that actually varies kind of along this kind of variable and kind of convoluted line.
Maybe I'll kind of try to develop this a little bit. So, I mean, in a way, I really just wanted to ask you how your projects work, but not so much in the sense of the intricate detail with which we've been, in which you've described them, but how they work as projects. Like, these things are not going to get built. I mean, that's what we presume from the beginning. So we're not necessarily. That's the fiction. The fiction part is maybe more important than the science part in this functional understanding of the project, where what matters is not directly, hopefully indirectly, but not directly, the actual realization of these projects, right? So in that sense, they're different than your classic modernist, urban plan. There are a couple of ways in which they differ. Even on a tabula rasa site, they reject tabula rasa strategies, right? The site is historicized, constructed, deconstructed, elaborated, and all kind as an artifact, and as part of the project rather than as simply a kind of blank slate. The other thing, so in that sense, the wonderful drawings that all of you showed, even though they share some of the characteristics of a kind of broadacre city master plan or the AQUEOUS or those kinds of large-scale managing the documents that have historically been used to project visions of cities along the lines that Enrique is asking. Actually, their realism and is sort of paradoxical, right? Because what's real about these things is their fictional character, and that seems incredibly instrumental here. If the instrumentality is to be understood as like basically getting people like the DDC and everybody else to talk about this stuff and to deal with it, to confront this problem. Okay, so that's a little bit what I mean. But just to give it a little more depth or perspective, I can imagine, I mean, one of the things vis-a-vis the edge question, with the documents that everybody here can go visit actually, it's in the library. You have to go deep into the library. I don't know, I invite you to do that one day where the books are. And somewhere there you will find a print of Piranesi's Campo Marzio plan, which is it's a kind of monument to a certain way of thinking about a city, which has persisted in the architectural imagination really up till I'd say about the 1980s or 90s. The city as a collection of artifacts. It's the marshlands of Rome, so we've moved from Venice to Rome, reimagined through the archaeological imagination of Piranesi, basically by a kind of science fiction reconstruction of what Rome used to be, sort of, but never really, as a future projection of a kind of, imagined city, made of very, very tightly bounded, hyper-articulated, geometrically complex artifacts, right? Now, again, in response to this question, these projects, all of them, including the others in the exhibition, seem to say there is no such city anymore, or if there is such a city, it's in the background. It's the city of skyscrapers and grids and so on. That is New York. It's the city of self-contained artifacts. Instead, we live now in the city of blurry edges, of gradients, of nature-culture hybridity, and so on. So there's no more nature. So whereas Piranesi could project this city of human artifice against the background of a marsh, like a kind of nature. These cities require some other relationship between humans and nature, even before you design them. They imagine that and they project that. So, okay, so if that's enough of a kind of frame, then what about this problem of like this sort of science fiction character of the work? Because one of the things I think compels us to reimagine our world in the way that you've been doing is the catastrophic, let's say, consequence of the human to nature opposition that ecology tries to undermine. All, you know, various sort of environmentalist discourse has been dealing with. So, you know, in other words, if what we're dealing with is a kind of historical catastrophe, and the consequence for architecture is nice waterfronts, what about this sort of darker side of the science fiction? I know some of you have alluded to this, trying to draw it out a little bit. You know, the dead bodies floating up from Philadelphia, basically, or from Bangladesh, and that, because that's really what we're talking about. I mean, metaphorically speaking, I hope. Anyway, the real future.
I would say, I mean, I think that that's one of the major critiques of you know, of the situation. But I mean, and what I'm fighting against always is this notion that once we discovered global warming, it was already too late. Thing. So, so I took a position in our project, which is like to not visualize a future. I mean, even though you have to do that to some degree, but to not project a visualization of a future that is a kind of a bubble on the horizon, but to show sets of tools and attitudes and approaches that could get one from here to there. And it was actually, I don't want to say it was a kind of a communications strategy, but to some degree I felt like our project evolved into an architectural exploration that was equal parts communication and equal parts kind of technique.
But I think there was a culture within the residency itself that already kind of presupposed a more optimistic attitude.
You have to explain residency.
So
they don't understand.
Basically,
this is a whole kind of...
Yeah, it was like Top Chef and Project Runway combined.
It's basically a reality show.
No, none of these projects that you see are, you know, typical of any of our practices. At least speaking for ourselves, in any way, I would say somewhere between a project in our office, a studio here at Columbia, and something else. And there are other actors, the people who actually did most of the work, who are not here with us today. But there's a culture of optimism, I think, that was already, you know, inscribed within the Latrobe study, within all the sort of meetings we had. I think there was a general tendency with, you know, for all of us to shy away from the kind of description of dystopia that I think is already commandeered by the media, and show another kind of approach that is instrumental at some level, whether or not it's solving or ever will solve real problems. But the word you started your long question with was how, you know, how do they work, your projects? And I guess the word work, if we return to it, I mean, and unpack it a little bit, I mean, on the one hand, how is it instrumental as a solution? How does it work as a project? You intimated, like, how does it hold together conceptually, or what's the elegance and rigor of it? Or how does it work as an enduring image?
Yeah.
You'd be surprised, though, to the extent to which the city agency people, like Amanda Burden, our Commissioner of Planning, and other people are actually very interested in these things, and are attending a lot of our you know, boat tours and talking to us and saying, well, no, we're actually, you know, going to, you know, initiate studies and see to what extent some of these solutions or, you know, approaches could in fact be addressed. But I don't think any of us said or you know, thought, well, here's a solution that's global. I think it's seen as a provocation, and in our instance, rather than describing a scenario, just a single image of the future. And the weakest part of our project, to be candid for a second, I think, is the one image that is an image. You know, and I regret that one, but...
You mean which one? Like
well, there's a rendering, which I never want to show again. But what I'm comfortable with, I think, and, you know, I'm revealing a little bit of the complexity of the whole project. It's not something in our office that we can totally control. But what I'm really more comfortable with, I think, is the list of zoning recommendations that is just more of a provocation. Like, how can we deal with this as a problem that is much larger than about an edge, that is about social issues, that is about water quality, whatever, you know, each of us bring up, that is a huge problem. So it defies the elegant diagrammatic solution of some of the other projects we might, you know, aspire to.
And I think that, I mean, for me to get back to the question of how this works in the context of an exhibition at MoMA and as a kind of political provocation, if you will. I mean, I think the idea for us that was, on the one hand, difficult, which is that, yes, in this kind of science fictional projection that in the end is a fiction in the sense that none of us really knows the determinacy of this outcome, that there's a high degree of ambiguity, even if, although we all buy into the particular premise of what the specifics of how this will play out will be. There was a sort of necessary impetus, I think, to conceive about the production of image. So I think the status of image here that Eric's alluding to was an extremely problematic one, because we knew that we had to generate work that would be legible by a broader public. This was not sort of intended simply as either a series of technical solutions, which frankly we are not necessarily the people to propose in the most efficient way, nor was it understood as a kind of theoretical, high-minded conceptual exercise. It was understood as in a certain level, not to put it too bluntly, but as a visualization that would engage a larger public within the kind of debate or the kind of discourse surrounding this, as well as agencies and sort of departments, for instance, the city planning components that are being referred to here, in ways that they may not be engaged in a more academic discourse. So I think that was intriguing for us, because on the one hand, we would resist, I think, and I think we all probably had a certain resistance to producing, say, solutions that were in a way overly defined or produce simply a kind of iconic and kind of recognizable image along the lines of the kinds of historical architectural antecedents that you're referring to. On the other hand, it had to be engaging in a way that it could be conveyed to that audience, as well as sort of offer a kind of provocation that this was not to take a kind of dystopian circumstance, right, the kind of projected scenario of sea level rise, and turn it into something sort of engaging and optimistic, so that it wouldn't simply be kind of ignored. So there was a level of invention. I guess we also felt that as architects, our kind of role could be to bring a degree of invention and a certain level, a level of paradoxically a kind of pleasure into visualizing what this sort of seemingly kind of negative scenario might be.
And just as a quick follow-up to the sort of human-natural dialogue that you set out too, I mean, I feel like one of the things that we were interested in engaging is, you know, obviously it immediately provokes the limits, a discussion of the limits of architecture, right? And like the limits of a museum exhibition about architecture where you see a painting by Zaha Hadid in a frame and you kind of get it or you don't get it and you move on. Because, I mean, clearly the global warming and sea level rise have been, you know, created as a result of human behavior and therefore require behavior change to be mediated in any sort of way. So the role of architecture, I think, shifts from one that is illustrative or of a project to one that is generative of a behavior change to some degree. So I also feel like the output of the show or of you in the next 20, 30 years will be, you know, will be successful based on those merits.
I actually have another question. I mean, as far as I understand, yeah. Oh, shall we do?
No, go ahead, and then we'll.
Okay. As far as I understand, the brief basically mentioned Venice deliberately as a precedent. Basically, the idea of imagining public space through water. I mean, as far as I remember from the presentation at MoMA, Guy Nordesen basically mentioned that. My question is basically, to what extent did you welcome and celebrate the idea of, let's say, rethinking New York via Venice, and to what extent do you basically, as New Yorkers, resisted that? And the question being that I think it's actually a delicate reference Venice today, because of the fact that Manhattan is actually becoming Venice itself. The fact that it's gradually becoming kind of a touristic playground, and probably the Highland being the ultimate symptom of that condition. So the question would be, to what extent, do you celebrate, and to what extent do you kind of debate the question of Venice as a model?
Well, one of the key clues about our position on that would be a shift in thinking from land-centric, Manhattan-centric understanding of the city to AQUEOUS, right? So and this was actually a provocation that Guy Nordesen's book already provided us. What if the center of New York were to shift to the Upper Bay? So in other words, it's no longer an island, let's say. Figuratively or figuratively, we are now inverting that condition. So Venice is a model in that sense, that was no longer kind of a. So in other words, I think those of us who cling to a certain image of Manhattan would find these projects sort of a terrible softening in a sense of a very kind of wonderful city. But at the same time, let's think of it as a regional condition that's fluctuating, that has many new dynamic connections and so on. So I think that's how we approached it.
Go.
Yeah.
No.
Do we have questions out there? We can keep going here. All right.
All of your projects deal with Manhattan, which is a relatively sort of ecologically sustainable structure as it is.
No, only one project deals with Manhattan. I'm sorry, just to. It's ARO's project, so it hasn't, and it wasn't shown today. The projects you've seen are dealing with Brooklyn and Staten Island, and New Jersey. That's right.
Could any of, and also they're not intended to be developed, obviously. You've done a tremendous amount of research, and there's a lot of cutting edge technology involved. Could any of these projects influence other sort of less sustainable areas, maybe more inland areas in a smaller scale way? Like, it seems like kind of a waste that a lot of this work is not going to get implemented. Has that been a consideration as to how you could use some of the technology in areas outside of this region?
I think in talking about the broader audience for the exhibit, we sort of felt like the audience is really global cities, but I don't know, it could be, because it's really incredible when you start to research, the sheer percentage of population that lives in, below at sea level or within sort of the threat of the sort of, 50-year inundation period, delta cities, that maybe that, that the projects could be powerful relative to some of these other global cities that are going to be facing some of the same issues. And I think ideally that one could, go through the exhibit and synthesize a set of techniques out of the 5 projects that could be utilized like a toolbox in any city, inland or water-based.
Right after Katrina, I forget the exact name of the body, but the American Society of Civil Engineers, I think it was, made a visit to the Netherlands to look at the Delta project, which so far I think is still the largest infrastructural project on Earth, bigger than the Three Gorges Dam. And the Delta project is basically a response to sea level rise, but mostly storm surges throughout Holland, southwest Holland, Zeeland specifically. And it's comprised of a series of barriers. And actually, we took our Columbia students there 2 years ago, the Option Studio students. But so I think any solution has possibility of being transferred to another set of conditions. But clearly, there's a set of specific conditions. The Oosterschelde barrier, just prior to its completion in the Netherlands, was made to be permeable when they realized that the ecosystem of the estuary would just be completely destroyed. So they let the water seep in and out just a little bit. And that was only possible because it lasted so long. It took so long to build, like decades, basically. So the thinking is, but I think that each of the projects is scalable, or at least contains elements that could be applied in different aggregations. And like, for instance, our islands and the inflatable barriers, which in fact they are being used in the Netherlands and in Japan. The whole idea is that you don't have to have a dam. You can have, and we rarely need these things, but sometimes we do need to prevent a storm surge from destroying a vast residential area. So these are scalable ideas, for instance, I think.
I mean, currently, to take off on the work in New Orleans, there is a very large-scale project now relative to the re-engineering of the lower Mississippi River Delta, where the flows of the Mississippi and the way it kind of relates to the territory around New Orleans is being restructured at a kind of radical, broad scale. As part of a major kind of government initiative. As part of that, one of the things that's being sort of examined is the kind of role of the wetlands, which, because of the channelization of the river for shipping, have been kind of gradually kind of depleted over the course of the last 100 years or so, and have been really seen as one of the major sources for the kind of devastating impact of Katrina in those territories, which is that this kind of pre-existing porous edge, which kind of acted as a zone of kind of deterrence for storm surge, had been kind of decimated. Guy Nordenson, actually, who did the Latrobe study at the kind of impetus of the Rising Currents project, is actually looking at that context. I think the hope is that some of these ideas will begin to kind of infiltrate and kind of disseminate. I mean, I think there was a recent discussion with some of the city agencies where, you know, the kind of reality that it's very unlikely that without some major kind of catastrophic event, or at least the kind of threat of it, that these kinds of massive, large-scale infrastructural projects are going to be effected in the short term in New York City. I think one of the hopes is that when the water does start to rise and some of these things may actually become necessary in a more kind of short-term way, that these solutions, these studies, and this research will be out there to be kind of called from, to be taken advantage of, and that the thinking already may be somewhat changed in terms of the way people might approach these. But there are incredible bureaucratic and kind of structural barriers to that, and I think that the hope is that this begins to make inroads.
I would put a question back to Reinhold, and that was your premise on what the projects are and this notion of, you know, they're never going to get built. Like,
it's not a criticism.
Why is but why is that? I mean, this is, I don't want to be critical, but this is like Mickey Mouse stuff. I mean, we've all been doing this in graduate schools for the last 15 years in my studios and all of our studios. So, I mean, what is the trope of this kind of thinking that this is somehow like, oh, you know, it's a museum project? I mean, what is that saying? I mean, even this notion of the Mississippi, which, you know, has been on the boards for 20 years. I mean, the second that the Mississippi River was levied, there started to be land subsidence at the rate of football fields per day, and literally Louisiana is losing a huge percentage of its land. Like, but then the actual rerouting of the Mississippi is it's like 23 million. I mean, it's some kind of figure which I'm like, somebody write a check. I mean, it's so basic and it's so, you know, why is it that there is no ability to move in ways that are other than aggregate? Because, I mean, that's also, I'm kind of falling back to the thesis of the oyster texture project, but there seems to be a complete inability to coordinate, organize, and fund big construction projects, with the exception of bridges and roads and you know, projects that are somehow subsidized by big industry. So the fact that the presumption is that these projects would never get built kind of infuriates me, because, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense as architects to somehow accept that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to imply some sort of defeatist position. It's sort of the opposite. The reason for maybe, you know, provoking on that score is to ask what constitutes the reality of the work that we do. It is very interesting to hear the response, even the questions, as people go to more important things. The questions that have to do with like technological, I don't know, at least one, and probably there are more, technological issues. I mean, this would be described in old language as functionalism, the language that we're speaking. So functionalism is back. That's the other conclusion you can arrive at. And functionalism speaks about, you know, kind of practical reality in certain ways, and including the possibility of realizing one's ambitions. The other related concept would be a kind of realism, where the down-to-earthness, that even though it's in a MoMA, you know, it's accessible, first of all, to a larger than classic MoMA audience, because anyway, MoMA has changed. It's become a shopping mall, basically, and we have to acknowledge that. It's become Venice. But also that's what's real. What's real is policy, or, you know, or politics, in that sense, in the sense of like people writing the check and so on. And I totally agree. I mean, I'm not the least bit disagreeing with that, you know, kind of premise. But I think in order to get at the question, we have to ask, you know, exactly what you asked. Why is that? And I don't think there's a practical answer to that question. I think there's an ideological answer to that question. And that's where architecture operates. Architecture operates at the discursive level. it changes people's minds. It doesn't, whether it's built or not.
And that's how I understood your point, actually, about science and fiction.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, for us, what is pleasurable about this whole experience is precisely the ambiguity between those two conditions. I mean, I don't think we ever set out to say, this is how you're going to solve the world. But there was a grain, of course, of honest, just sincere thinking about that, of course. On the other hand, we wanted to make an art project or something that's, we wanted to get into representation or whatever, just like understanding the context of this as being in MoMA and not, some planning, publication. So it's clearly has its context defining it. But I think at the same time, we're all sincerely trying to, address the issues.
Yeah, sure.
And then those are not necessarily antithetical positions, right? That in the
Right.
end, the production of the kind of compelling architectural documents is the thing that can actually, in fact, engender kind of real change potentially, right? And I think that's what becomes quite interesting here, is that there's really a kind of conflation of those movements. And in other words, that these things simply were yet another kind of dry planning study that kind of solved in a kind of technocratic way the necessity of this in a kind of pure functionalist way. I don't think they would have the headway or the possible impact that they do if, I think as we all also hope, these things became sort of their own accord, provocative documents, provocative kind of architectural explorations, and engaged a level of kind of invention and sort of productivity that in a way is appropriate to both the context of the MoMA, kind of foregoing its kind of mollification in a way, but also I think a desire that we all had to not simply answer the question, but to do something else, right? To kind of transform that initial question into something that was also satisfying to us, right? As architects, as designers.
That's happening.
Yeah, I mean,
Something.
there's this great quote by Daniel Moynihan, this sort of eminent former senator, who, he basically grew up around Times Square, and he actually didn't know that Manhattan was an island because when he was growing up, the waterfront was this really heavy industry, on the waterfront, the kind of classic waterman kind of, no-go zone of ill repute. And of course, I mean, that's directly, I think, tied to the economic context. And where I think New York is making a mistake is that New York is now kind of in this process of wholesale transforming its waterfront into, we were 100% industrial, and now we're going to be 100% recreational.
Yeah.
And it's completely ill-informed, because the way that New York will actually re-engage its waterfront, I mean, okay, so I have a project in Battery Park City. There's one boat tie-up in Battery Park City. That's something, I mean, it's the land is reaching the water, but it's not necessarily this kind of engagement. I mean, another kind of thing that irks me is that, the water used to be, I mean, it still is in some cases, this kind of major kind of infrastructure, transporting waste, salt, barges of garbage. But all of that has now been eliminated from waterfront usage. So until New York can find some kind, I mean, a classic example is Brooklyn Bridge Park, which I wouldn't criticize from a point of landscape. There's trees and rolling hills and, but I used to get wood there. There used to be a lumber yard there, which you could buy, and it was working piers. So this kind of wholesale transformation to, high-end residential and Gaslight Park is very ill-advised because it will not lead to what you're talking about, which is this kind of re-engagement, not without multiple industries, smaller industries, scales of transport, being able to reimagine a kind of a more regional economy. I mean, we're talking about like Hanjin ships now. The Panama Canal was like widened because it wasn't wide enough for the Hanjin kind of shipping operations. So like, what does that mean for this economy of scale? I mean, we have to like recalibrate some of those sort of this global economy and be able to reclaim a kind of a regionalism, I think, relative to the waterfront and a mix of economic, recreational, living, fishing, a real mix of kind of productivity in the zone.
I mean, there's huge missed opportunities, like the one you suggest. At the same time, the city planning, commission agency does actually say that they want a multiple waterfront, and I mean, we saw some wonderful presentations. There is a kind of emerging, I think, consensus that we made mistakes. I mean, with all these condos everywhere and parks. But I agree with Kate. I couldn't agree more. And it's because New York's becoming less important. So we don't have huge shipping and so on. Things are just moving to other cities. So go fishing.
And here you are, nevertheless. So Enrique, what do you think? Are we done? Are they going to have some more questions?
We can have one last question.
We have 4 minutes.
Okay.
You come 15 minutes late, you can go 15 minutes late to studio if you want.
Yes, studio. Yeah, let's take one more.
Wow, no arguments. Almost one argument.
Shall we try?
It's the hardest thing to generate. No, there should be one. That's our technique. We wait, basically.
We're gonna wait. Go ahead. Ringer.
Yeah, I mean, Fresh Kills has an interesting political history too, because it was the dump for New York. I mean, barges dumped all of the 5 boroughs' garbage in Staten Island, so the city came up with the idea to, as part of the sort of Giuliani shift, to close, to get the Staten Island Republican vote to close the landfill and give it as a park, as a sort of a gift to the residents. So that sort of core gesture of making this formerly, what was a wetland that then became this amazing, masses of dumps of garbage into a park. And that's also happened all along the, in Jamaica Bay, there are former landfills that have been planted and so on. And, and I would say that the issue that I have there is that New York closed that landfill without a plan for its garbage. And so we ended up trucking garbage and putting our garbage on rails where it was transported as far as Idaho, in most cases to sort of Virginia, Ohio. So for me, I am I wrote articles about the competition and lauding it, but at the same time, it was in this lack of a larger discussion about the notion of being a productivity really, and systems that really are urban systems. And I mean, this comment was made about Manhattan, and that these projects are, Manhattan being like this inherently sustainable, dense situation. And so one of the main issues that we really have to deal with is waste. We're incredibly sustainable in terms of party walls and heating, but we have not solved that waste problem. So I thought that that Fresh Kills is an amazing achievement by the city, but at the same time, it was generated as a sort of a political gesture without this kind of larger discussion about waste. And you know, at the same time, there's many technologies like waste to energy or the combustion of waste to create electricity that were completely off the table, that are incredibly sustainable because of, you know, sort of local issues. So it was sort of an amazing gesture, but at the same time lacking some sort of larger